The dust beneath that abandoned lodge had not been disturbed in months, maybe years. But something was moving down there. Could hear it. Soft and desperate. The kind of sound that freezes the blood of anyone who has spent decades in the African bush like I have. My name is Daniel Thompson. I am 63 years old. My knees complain every morning. My hands carry scars from a life I tried to leave behind. But when the ranger station received that call about possible survivors near the old Mara Ridge Lodge, something in my chest tightened. I knew that lodge. God help me, I knew it too well. When I lowered myself onto that rotting wooden deck and extended my gloved hand into the gap beneath the concrete foundation, I expected fear. What I did not expect was rage. 2 sets of claws, impossibly small but sharp as thorns, tore through the thick leather of my glove in seconds. The sound that followed was not the mewing of helpless cubs. It was a roar in miniature. Pure hatred compressed into bodies no bigger than house cats. Those tiny paws were not asking for help. They were declaring war on the only creature that could save them. I did not pull my hand back. I had learned something in the 7 years since I stopped being the man I once was. Sometimes salvation requires staying exactly where it hurts the most. So I lay there, my cheek pressed against wood that smelled of rot and abandonment, my right arm extended into darkness, while 2 orphaned lion cubs did everything in their small power to destroy me. Let me tell you about that lodge. The Mara Ridge Lodge was built in the 1980s, back when hunting tourism was not just legal but celebrated. I knew every inch of it because I had used it as my base of operations for 12 years. The men who came through those doors paid extraordinary amounts of money for what they called adventure, and I was exceptional at giving it to them. I knew the animal corridors. I knew the watering holes. I knew the territories of every pride within a 100-kilometer radius. I had been, in the language of that world, one of the best. The lodge had been shut down for 8 years, ever since Kenya tightened restrictions and the owner fled fraud charges in Nairobi. Now it stood as a monument to a different era. Windows broken. Walls covered in vines. Foundations slowly being reclaimed by the red earth of the Mara. I had not been back here in all that time. I had no reason to return to the place where I had been someone I could no longer recognize in the mirror. But 2 days before, a Maasai herder named Kimani had reported hearing cubs crying near the old lodge. Not just crying, screaming. The kind of distress calls that mean a mother is dead and her children are dying alone. The ranger station sent 3 people to investigate, but the approach of multiple humans drove whatever was there deeper into hiding. When I heard the location, I insisted on going alone. Something about that specific place demanded I be the one to face it. The drive out took 3 hours on roads that barely deserved the name. The lodge appeared through the acacia trees like a ghost. Once white walls now stained brown and green. Roof partially collapsed on the eastern side. I parked my Land Rover 50 meters away and approached on foot, moving slowly, making myself as small and non-threatening as a man my size could manage. The silence was wrong. The Mara is never truly silent. There are always birds, insects, the distant calls of animals navigating their territories. But here nothing. As if the land itself was holding its breath. I found the cubs by following the smell. Not the smell of death, though that would come later in ways that would break me. This was the smell of fear. Sharp and acrid. Mixed with urine and something else that took me a moment to identify. Poison. The bitter chemical tang of toxins that hunters use to bait carcasses, ensuring that scavengers die alongside their intended targets. My stomach turned. I knew that smell better than I wanted to admit. The gap beneath the lodge was narrow, maybe 30 centimeters high, stretching back into darkness under the concrete slab that formed the foundation. I got down on my belly, clicked on my flashlight, and angled the beam into the space. 2 pairs of eyes reflected back at me. Green, gold, and terrified. The cubs were pressed into the farthest corner, maybe 3 meters back. Their bodies so small and thin that my heart seized. They could not have been more than 8 weeks old. Maybe less. I spent the first hour just lying there, speaking in a low, steady voice. Not words that mattered. Just sound. The rhythm of a human who was not shouting, not threatening, not bringing the violence they had learned to expect. I told them about the weather, about the drive out here, about the warthog family I had seen near the main road. Anything to fill the silence with something other than their terror. The second hour I started pushing things toward them. A metal bowl of water dragged slowly across the dirt. Then pieces of raw impala meat from my cooler, torn into strips small enough for baby teeth. The cubs did not move toward any of it. They just watched, their small bodies pressed together, their ears flat against their heads. By the third hour my shoulder was screaming and my back had gone numb. The sun was directly overhead now, turning the deck into an oven. But I could not risk moving. Any sudden motion might break whatever fragile thread was being built in that darkness. So I stayed, my arm extended, my hand open and still, while sweat soaked through my shirt and flies landed on my face. It was the smaller cub who moved first. Female, I would learn later. Though in that moment all I saw was a flash of golden fur and the sudden sharp pain as claws found the exposed skin between my glove and sleeve. She did not bite. She just held on, her entire body rigid as if preparing for the blow she knew would come. When it did not, when I remained absolutely motionless despite the blood running down my forearm, something shifted. The second cub, slightly larger, moved to his sister's side. This one did bite, sinking small but sharp teeth into the thumb of my glove. Still I did not pull back. I let them hold me there. Let them test whether this human would respond with the violence that had taken their mother, taken their safety, taken everything they knew. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the female released her grip. She did not retreat. Instead she moved closer, her nose working overtime, processing the scent of this strange creature who refused to act the way humans were supposed to act. The male followed, more cautious, his body low to the ground. I waited until they were both within arm's reach before I slowly, with movements so gradual they were almost invisible, closed my fingers around the water bowl and pushed it the final few centimeters toward them. The female sniffed it, then looked back at me, her eyes asking a question that shattered something in my chest. Can I trust this? Is this real or is this just another trap? I blinked slowly, a gesture I had learned from watching cats all my life. In their language it means safety, means friend. The cub held my gaze for 3 long heartbeats, then lowered her head and began to drink. Her brother joined her moments later, and the sound of their desperate lapping filled the space beneath the lodge with something that might have been hope. It took another 2 hours before they were willing to come out. By then the sun was beginning its descent, painting the acacia trees in shades of copper and gold. I had moved back to sit on the lodge steps, giving them space, letting them make the choice. When they finally emerged, blinking in the light, I got my first clear look at what survival had cost them. They were tiny, far too small for their age if my guess was right. Their ribs showed through their golden fur. Their paws seemed oversized on their stick-thin legs. But it was their eyes that broke me. Those were not the eyes of cubs. Those were the eyes of creatures who had seen their world end and somehow kept breathing anyway. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out more meat, placing it on the ground between us. The female approached first, as she had before. But this time she did not take the food and retreat. She ate right there, 3 feet from me, while her brother circled around to approach from the other side. They were working together, I realized, covering angles, making sure that if this human attacked, at least one of them might escape. The thought of what they must have witnessed to develop that strategy made me want to scream. When they had eaten everything I brought, the male cub sat back and began grooming his sister's face, his tiny tongue working over her ears. It was such a normal, innocent gesture that I had to look away, my throat tight. These were babies. They should have been playing under their mother's watchful eye, learning to pounce on her tail, tumbling through grass under an endless sky. Instead they were here, alone, planning escape routes from the creature trying to save them. As the light faded, I made a decision that went against every protocol in the Ranger Handbook. I could not leave them out here tonight. The lodge was not safe. Hyenas knew this territory, and these cubs were in no condition to defend themselves. But I also could not force them into a crate. Could not chase them down and prove that their fear had been justified all along. So I did something that probably qualified as insane. I lay down on the deck, my head pillowed on my pack, and closed my eyes. For a long time nothing happened. I could hear them moving in the darkness. Small paws on wood. The occasional soft chirp that cubs make when nervous. Then, when the moon was high and the temperature had dropped to the point where my breath misted in the air, I felt weight settle against my side. First one cub, then the other, pressing into my warmth because they were cold and scared, and I was, despite everything, alive and solid and there. I did not move, barely breathe. I just lay there under the African stars, feeling the small heartbeats against my ribs, and let tears run silently down my temples into my hair. In the morning, when the sun turned the eastern sky pink and gold, I sat up slowly. The cubs scrambled back, but not as far this time. Only a few feet. Their bodies tense but not fleeing. In the growing light I could see them clearly for the first time. And that was when my world stopped. The female cub had a marking behind her left ear. 3 dark spots in a pattern that formed an imperfect triangle. I knew that marking. I had seen it through a rifle scope 7 years ago. Had watched it disappear into the darkness after a shot that should have killed its owner. My hands began to shake. The male cub had a marking too. Different but just as distinctive. A pattern of spots on his muzzle that formed almost a star shape, spreading out from his nose across the bridge of his face. I had documented that same pattern in my notes back when I was tracking a specific pride. Back when I was learning the individuals so I could predict their movements for my clients. These were not just any lion cubs. These were Zara's children. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Zara. The lioness who had changed everything. The one who had looked at me while bleeding from a wound I had given her. Looked with eyes that were not animal but somehow more than animal. And then vanished into a night that should have been her grave. I had spent 7 years searching for proof that she had survived. I had covered thousands of kilometers. Talked to every ranger and researcher in the region. Studied every pride composition report that crossed my desk. I had never found her. Because while I was searching, someone else, using the same methods I had taught, the same tactics I had perfected, had finished what I started. And now her children, bearing her unique markings like genetic signatures, were sitting in front of me. Orphans because of the world I had helped create. Dying because of the tools I had put into circulation. I reached out with trembling hands. And this time when I touched them I was not just feeling for injuries. I was searching for something else. Something I desperately needed to not find. My fingers moved gently over their small bodies. Checking limbs. Ribs. The female submitted to the examination with unusual stillness, as if she knew this was important. The male tried to squirm away but lacked the strength to put up real resistance. That was when I found it. Under the fur, beneath the surface, both cubs were burning up. Not with fever, though that was present too. This was something else. My veterinary training, limited but practical, kicked in. Checked their gums. Pale and slightly blue. Their breathing too fast and shallow. The smell on their breath. That bitter chemical tang. Secondary poisoning. The toxin that killed their mother had not just killed her. It had saturated her body. And when these cubs, desperate and starving, had stayed with her carcass, had tried to nurse from her even as she grew cold, they had ingested enough poison to kill something twice their size. They should already be dead. The only reason they were still breathing was pure stubborn will to survive. I pulled out my satellite phone with hands that would not stay steady. I had maybe hours, not days, maybe less. Every minute that passed was one more minute the toxins destroyed their small organs from the inside out. I needed to get them to a vet. Needed equipment and medicine I did not have. Needed expertise beyond my field training. But the nearest facility with that kind of capability was 7 hours away. And these cubs could not survive a 7-hour drive in their condition. Which meant I had to do something I had sworn I would never do again. I had to make life or death decisions with insufficient information, insufficient tools, and no backup plan. I had to become a hunter again, not of animals, but of time itself. As I gathered the cubs carefully into a transport crate, padded with my own jacket, as I started the Land Rover and began calculating routes in my head, one thought kept circling back. I had found Zara's children. After 7 years of searching for her. Of needing to know she had survived. Of desperately wanting proof that my choice to stop, to change, had not come too late for at least one life. I had finally found the answer. She had survived my bullet. She had lived. Had found a mate. Had given birth to these 2 perfect impossible cubs. She had done everything a lioness was meant to do. And then men like I used to be had killed her anyway. The cubs made small distressed sounds from the crate as the vehicle bounced over rough terrain. I drove faster than was safe. One hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to let small teeth and claws grip my fingers through the metal bars. I talked to them constantly. My voice steady even as my mind raced through everything I knew about toxicology. About organ failure. About the narrow window where intervention might still matter. I had spent 7 years looking for Zara. Now I had 4 hours, maybe 6 if I was lucky, and they were strong, to save the only part of her that remained. The sun climbed higher. The Mara stretched out in every direction, indifferent and eternal. And I drove toward a redemption I had no guarantee of reaching, carrying 2 lives that should have been impossible, that should never have been my responsibility, that should never have needed saving in the first place. In the back seat, 2 small and 2 brave Zara's children held on. The ranger station at Mara West had not been built for this. It was designed for paperwork, for coordinating patrols, for radio communications with the tourist camps that dotted the reserve. It had never been intended as an emergency veterinary clinic for dying lion cubs. But when I arrived 4 hours after leaving the lodge, tires smoking and engine screaming, it was the only option that did not involve watching Zara's children die in the back of my vehicle. Dr. Sarah Kimathi was on site by pure chance. She normally worked out of the main conservation center in Nairobi, but she had been conducting field research on elephant populations. When my frantic satellite call came through, she met me at the station entrance, already pulling on gloves, her field kit open on the hood of her truck. One look at the cubs and her expression went grim. We worked in the small office that served as the station's administrative center. Clearing the desk with one sweep of my arm. Sending papers and coffee cups scattering across the floor. Nobody complained. The 3 other rangers present understood what was happening. Understood that those small golden bodies represented something beyond their own survival. This was about whether the good guys could win occasionally, whether change mattered, whether the past could ever be balanced by the present. Dr. Kimathi worked with the speed and precision of someone who had performed field triage countless times. But even she hesitated when she saw the blood work results from the portable analyzer. I watched her face and knew before she said anything. I had seen that expression before. On the faces of vets who had given up. Who were already preparing the compassionate speech about suffering and mercy. I did not let her say it. Instead I began rattling off everything I knew about the toxin. About the dose they likely received. About the fact that they had survived this long when they should not have made it through the first night. I talked about their mother's strength. About genetics. About the possibility that Zara had carried some resistance that she passed to her children. I was making half of it up, grasping at scientific straws. But I could not stop. Because if I stopped talking, if I let silence fill the room, Dr. Kimothy would say the words that would end everything. She listened, her hands never stopping their work, inserting the foreline into the female cub's tiny foreleg with a gentleness that made my throat tight. When I finally ran out of words, she looked up at me with eyes that had seen too many losses. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "Yes, we'll try." The first 72 hours were hell measured in millimeters. The cubs, too weak to resist, lay in makeshift incubators constructed from plastic storage bins and heating pads. Tubes ran into their small bodies, delivering fluids, electrolytes, activated charcoal to bind the remaining toxins, antibiotics to fight the infections that were inevitable given their compromised immune systems. I did not leave. I pulled a chair up between the two bins and sat there, my hands resting on the sides so the cubs could feel me, could know they were not alone. The female cub, the one I had started calling Amara in my head after the Swahili word for grace, crashed first. Her heart rate dropped, her breathing became irregular, and for 6 minutes that lasted 6 years, the monitor showed a rhythm that meant death was winning. Dr. Kimothy worked with steady hands, injecting medications that I could not name, adjusting dosages with calculations she did not explain. And somehow, impossibly, Amara came back. Her heart steadied, her breathing evened out, and she opened eyes that were clouded with pain but still fighting. The male cub, Taraji, meaning eagle, held on with a stubbornness that reminded me so much of Zara it hurt to breathe. Where Amara was grace under pressure, Taraji was pure defiance. He growled at the tubes, tried to bite the monitoring equipment, and made angry sounds that should not have been possible from something so small and broken. It was the sound of a creature who refused to believe that death had any authority over him. On the 4th day they started eating again. Just a little. Formula from a bottle at first. But it was something. I fed them myself, holding each cub against my chest, feeling their small bodies pressed against me while they nursed with desperate intensity. Amara was neat and methodical. Taraji made a mess and complained the entire time. Normal cub behavior starting to emerge from beneath the trauma. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 7 years. At night, when the station was quiet and the other rangers had gone to their quarters, I would move the bins closer together so the cubs could see each other. They would make small chirping sounds, reaching tiny paws through the ventilation holes, trying to touch. On the 5th night, Dr. Kimothy found me asleep in my chair, one hand in each bin, small paws wrapped around my fingers, all 3 of us breathing in the same rhythm. She did not wake me. She just took a photo on her phone, not for social media or documentation, but because she knew this moment mattered. Because sometimes the story of a life changing is captured in stillness, in the space between breaths, in the way broken things hold on to each other in the dark. During those first weeks, while the cubs slowly climbed back from the edge, I found myself thinking about Zara more than I had allowed myself to in years. The memory I had locked away. The one I could not look at directly without feeling like my chest was caving in, kept surfacing. It always started the same way. The radio call. The client's excitement. The promise of a trophy that would make his reputation. It had been late afternoon. The light, that golden color that photographers call magic hour. That was when we found her. Zara had been in her prime then. 4 years old. Muscles rolling under her tawny coat. Moving with the kind of confidence that only apex predators possess. She was alone, which was unusual for a lioness but not unheard of. Sometimes they range solo between prides. Sometimes they are ousted by incoming males and searching for a new family. Whatever her story, she was exactly what the client wanted. I had set up the shot. I knew the range. Knew the wind. knew the rifle. I had done this hundreds of times. The client's hands were shaking with excitement, his breathing too fast. And I remembered thinking that this would probably take 2 shots. The first to wound, the second to finish. Quick by the standards of hunting, but never truly clean. What happened next had never happened before in all my years as a guide. The client fired. The shot was good, catching Zara in the left shoulder, precisely where I had instructed. She went down as physics demanded, her front legs buckling. But instead of the panic that wounded animals usually display, instead of the thrashing and the sounds of pain, Zara did something that changed the trajectory of my entire existence. She looked at me. Not at the client. Not at the rifle. Not at the vehicle. Me. Her head turned. Found me where I stood 20 meters away. And her eyes locked onto mine with an intelligence that was not supposed to exist in prey. It was not pleading. It was not fear. It was recognition. Pure and complete. In that moment Zara saw me. Not as a hunter. Not as a human. But as an individual who was choosing to end her life. And she wanted me to know that she understood exactly what I was. The client was already chambering the second round. Already raising the rifle for the finishing shot. But something in me fractured. I stepped forward, my hand coming up, and heard myself say words that ended my career before they were fully out of my mouth. Do not shoot. The client protested. The wounded animal protocol was clear. You do not leave something suffering. But I was already moving, covering ground between myself and Zara in long strides. My own rifle up now, but not aimed at her. Aimed at nothing. A useless gesture of a man who had suddenly realized he was on the wrong side of history. Zara watched me come. She was losing blood. Her shoulder dark and wet. But she did not try to run. She just watched. When I was close enough to see my own reflection in her eyes, close enough to smell the hot copper of her blood, she made a sound. Not a growl. Not a roar. Something softer. Almost questioning. And then, while I stood frozen in the moment that would define every day I had left to live, Zara pushed herself up on 3 legs and ran. She should not have made it. The wound was serious. The blood loss significant. But somehow Zara disappeared into the long grass and the failing light. And despite hours of tracking, despite the client's furious demands, despite everything I knew about following a wounded predator, we never found her. I quit 3 days later. Walked away from contracts worth more money than most people in Kenya would see in a lifetime. Watched my reputation collapse. Watched former friends and colleagues call me a traitor to the industry. I did not care. Could not care. Because every time I closed my eyes I saw Zara's face. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I ever held a rifle aimed at a living creature again, something essential in me would die completely. I spent the next 7 years making amends. Got my ranger certification. Took a position that paid a fraction of what I used to make. And devoted myself to anti-poaching efforts. But more than that, I searched. Every report of lion sightings. Every pride composition study. Every camera trap photo that came through the conservation network. I examined them all. Looking for 3 dark spots behind a left ear. Looking for proof that Zara had survived. That my choice to stop had mattered. That at least one life had been saved by my change of heart. I never found her. Because while I was changing, while I was learning to be a different kind of man, the world I left behind kept turning. Other hunters. Other clients. Other men who saw animals as commodities and death as entertainment. Someone had found Zara. Someone had finished what I could not. And her children had paid the price. By the 6th week, the cubs were strong enough to move to an outdoor enclosure. It was not large. Maybe 10 meters by 10 meters. But it had grass and rocks and a small pool fed by a garden hose. Dr. Kimathi had returned to Nairobi by then, leaving detailed care instructions and a promise to check in weekly. The other rangers helped me construct shade structures and hiding spots. creating an environment that was safe but not completely unnatural. Amara explored every centimeter of the enclosure on their first day outside. Her movements cautious but curious. She would approach a rock, sniff it thoroughly, then look back at me as if asking permission to continue. Taraji, true to his nature, tried to climb things. Fence. The shade structure. Me when I knelt down to refill their water bowl. The male cub had no fear. Only an absolute conviction that the world existed to be conquered. They grew. Not fast. Their early malnutrition had seen to that. But steadily. I weighed them weekly, recording their progress with the kind of attention to detail I had once reserved for tracking prey. Every 100 grams gained felt like a victory. Every new behavior. Every play session where they tumbled over each other without the shadow of trauma in their movements felt like proof that healing was possible. At night I would sit outside their enclosure, my back against the chain link while the cubs pressed against the fence from their side. I would talk to them about their mother, about Zara, telling them stories they could not understand but needed to hear anyway. I told them about her strength, about her courage, about the way she had chosen to live even when death should have claimed her. I never told them about my role in that story. Some confessions are too heavy for children to carry. Even animal children who would never comprehend the words. The nightmares started around week 8. Amara would wake screaming. Sound no cub should make. Her small body rigid with terror. I would go to her immediately, opening the enclosure against every safety protocol, and hold her until the shaking stopped. Sometimes it took minutes. Sometimes it took hours. Taraji would watch from a distance, his eyes reflecting moonlight, and I could never tell if the male cub was afraid or simply waiting his turn. When the nightmares came for Taraji, they were different. No screaming, no obvious signs of distress. He would just go completely still, staring at nothing. His body locked in a position that suggested he was watching something terrible unfold. The first time it happened, I thought the cub was having a seizure. I called Dr. Kimathi in a panic, describing the symptoms, prepared for the worst. She told me it was trauma. She told me that animals, especially intelligent social animals like lions, could suffer from post-traumatic stress just like humans. She told me to keep doing what I was doing, to be present, to let Taraji know he was safe. And when she hung up, I sat in the enclosure with Taraji frozen beside me and cried for everything these cubs had seen, everything they carried, everything that had been stolen from them before they were old enough to understand what having something meant. The healing was not linear. Some days were leaps forward, the cubs playing with a kind of wild joy that made my face hurt from smiling. Other days were steps backward, fear creeping in for no visible reason. Both cubs suddenly refusing to eat or cowering in the corner of their shelter. I learned to read the signs. Learned when to push forward and when to simply be present. I learned patience in ways my younger self never could have imagined. By month 3, the cubs had tripled their body weight, and their personalities had fully emerged. Amara was thoughtful, strategic, always watching before acting. She learned quickly, figured out how latches worked, and developed a talent for stealing things from my pockets when I was not paying attention. Taraji was bold, impulsive, and completely convinced of his own invincibility. He challenged everything, tested every boundary, and would regularly attempt to hunt me by hiding behind rocks that did not adequately cover his rear end, and then launching surprise attacks on my boots. They were, in other words, becoming exactly what lion cubs were meant to be. The question that I had been avoiding, the one that sat like a stone in my chest during every feeding and every play session, could not be ignored forever. What happened next? Cubs this young, this imprinted on human contact, could not simply be released into the wild. They had not learned to hunt from their mother, had not developed the social skills that would allow them to join another pride. had not acquired the wariness of humans that would keep them safe from poachers and problem wildlife teams. The standard protocol was clear. Human-raised cubs went to sanctuaries, lived out their lives in large enclosures, became ambassadors for education programs, cared for, and completely captive. It was a good life as lives went. Better than many wild lions experienced if you measured by longevity and security. But I could not stop thinking about Zara running on 3 legs into the darkness, choosing freedom even when it should have killed her. Could not stop thinking about the way she had looked at me, asserting her right to live on her own terms right up until the moment she vanished. If I sent her children to a sanctuary, no matter how spacious or well-managed, would I be honoring her legacy or betraying it? The debate kept me awake at night. I discussed it with Dr. Kimathi during her weekly calls, with the other rangers over evening meals, with the conservation officers who stopped by to check on the cubs' progress. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had valid points. No one had answers that satisfied the question burning in my chest. What would Zara want? I was sitting with the cubs one evening, watching them chase moths in the fading light, when Amara did something that changed everything. She caught a moth mid-flight, a perfectly executed leap and snap of jaws, and immediately brought it to me. Not to show off, not seeking praise. She dropped it at my feet, stepped back, and looked at me with an expression that I would swear contained expectation. She was trying to feed me. It was a behavior that cubs showed to their pride members, a way of strengthening social bonds, of saying you are family. The fact that she was doing it with a moth, which provided no real nutritional value, did not matter. The gesture was what counted. Amara considered me part of her pride, and she was demonstrating that she would provide for me the way pride members provide for each other. Taraji, not to be outdone, immediately began looking for his own moth to offer. He was less successful, his attack strategy consisting mainly of jumping in random directions and hoping to collide with something. But the intent was identical. These cubs, despite everything they had been through, despite the trauma and the loss and the impossibility of their survival, were trying to take care of the human who had saved them. I looked at those 2 small faces, covered in grass and dirt and the remains of their dinner, and felt something settle in my chest. Not certainty. I was not sure I would ever feel certain about anything again. But clarity perhaps. A sense of direction that had been absent since the moment I recognized Zara's markings on these tiny bodies. I could not send them to a sanctuary. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because what they needed was not safety. What they needed was a chance to become what they were meant to be. And the only person who could give them that chance was a man who had spent the first half of his life being excellent at the wrong thing and was now attempting to be adequate at the right thing. It was not a fair burden to place on myself. It was probably not even possible. But I had learned in the 7 years since Zara looked at me with recognition that fair and possible were not the standards by which a life should be measured. The only standard that mattered was whether you tried. As the sun set over the Mara, turning the sky into a canvas of amber and rose, I watched Zara's children play in the grass their mother would never see them climb. And I began, in the quiet of my own thoughts, to plan for something that everyone would tell me was impossible. I was going to teach them to be wild. Teaching lion cubs to hunt when you are not a lion is a problem that no textbook adequately addresses. I had veterinary manuals, wildlife behavior studies, and decades of observation to draw from. But none of it prepared me for the reality of trying to communicate in a language I did not speak to students who thought I was their extremely incompetent parent. The training area I constructed was 5 kilometers from the ranger station. Far enough to provide real terrain but close enough to reach in an emergency. It was a natural enclosure of sorts. A valley bounded by steep ridges on 3 sides and a seasonal river on the 4th. 20 hectares of grassland, acacia groves, and rocky outcrops. Not truly wild but wild enough to matter. I started when the cubs were 4 months old. still small enough to carry in a backpack when they tired, which was often. The first lessons were about awareness. I would walk the territory with Amara and Taraji, stopping every few meters to demonstrate tracking. I would kneel beside impala prints in the mud, letting the cubs sniff and examine, then follow the trail until we found where the herd had been grazing. I showed them how to read the wind, how to move through tall grass without creating waves that would alert prey, how to use rocks and termite mounds for cover. Amara understood immediately. She was a natural stalker, her body instinctively dropping into the hunting crouch that was hardwired into her genetics. She would watch my demonstrations with absolute focus, then attempt to replicate them with a seriousness that was almost comical given her size. When she successfully stalked and pounced on a grasshopper, she carried it around for an hour like it was a full-grown zebra, growling at Taraji when he tried to investigate her prize. Taraji's approach was different. He treated the whole thing as a game, which it was supposed to be at this stage, but with a level of chaos that made actual hunting seem impossible. He would charge at birds, announcing his presence with small roars that sent everything within 100 meters fleeing. He would get distracted by interesting smells and wander off course, then be surprised when his target was no longer where he left it. More than once I had to retrieve him from situations where his confidence had vastly exceeded his competence. But Taraji had something that could not be taught. He had absolute fearlessness. When we encountered a monitor lizard, a creature nearly as long as the young lion and equipped with sharp claws and a whip-like tail, Amara approached with appropriate caution. Taraji attacked it. The fight lasted 3 seconds before I intervened, pulling the cub back by his scruff while the lizard escaped into the undergrowth. Taraji's response was to immediately try to pursue, completely undeterred by the fact that he had just been thoroughly outmatched. The months passed in a rhythm of teaching and learning. I brought in live prey, starting with guinea fowl that were slow and relatively easy to catch. The first time Amara successfully hunted one on her own, the sound she made was not quite a roar but something close. Pure triumph. She had provided food through her own skill, had tapped into the genetic memory that made her what she was. I watched from 20 meters away, my heart simultaneously swelling with pride and breaking with the knowledge of what this meant. She was learning to not need me. By 8 months the cubs were hunting cooperatively. Amara would circle to one side, moving with the patience of a cat 10 times her age, while Taraji, in his role as the loud distraction, would approach from the opposite direction. Their success rate was still low, maybe 1 in 10 attempts, but they were learning. More importantly, they were learning together, developing the communication and coordination that pride hunting required. The nightmares continued but less frequently. Some nights I would hear them calling out in the darkness of the training area, and I would have to physically restrain myself from going to them. They needed to learn to comfort each other, to be each other's security. My constant presence, the thing that had saved them in the beginning, was now the thing that could prevent them from surviving on their own. It was the hardest lesson I had to teach myself: how to love something enough to let it struggle. At 10 months the cubs killed their first impala, a juvenile separated from its mother during a river crossing, weakened and perfect for inexperienced hunters. I watched from a ridge as Amara led the stalk, her movements now fluid and assured, while Taraji provided the speed for the final rush. The kill was not clean. It took longer than it would have with an experienced lioness, but it happened. And when the cubs began to feed, their faces buried in the meat that they had caught through their own effort, I knew that the decision I had been avoiding could no longer be postponed. They were ready. Not perfect, not experienced, but ready enough. The question was whether I was ready to let them go. Dr. Kimathi came out for the final evaluation. She spent 3 days observing the cubs, documenting their hunting attempts, their territorial behavior, their responses to the presence of other predators in the area. Her report was clinical, factual, and came to a conclusion that I had known in my heart for weeks. Rehabilitation to full release was possible. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they felt like a diagnosis of something terminal. The protocol for soft release was gradual. First, I would stop bringing supplemental food, forcing the cubs to hunt for all their nutrition. Then I would extend the time between my visits, teaching them that my presence was not guaranteed. Finally, I would stop coming altogether, monitoring from a distance through camera traps and radio collars, intervening only if their survival was clearly threatened. Each stage felt like cutting away a piece of my own body. When I stopped bringing food, Amara looked at me with an expression that could only be interpreted as betrayal. She understood that I had food in my vehicle, could smell it, and could not comprehend why I was refusing to share it. For 3 days she barely looked at me. Her attention focused entirely on hunting with Taraji. When they finally made a successful kill on their own, she did not bring me a piece the way she used to. The offering of food that had once signaled pack membership was no longer extended. I was no longer pride. It was exactly what needed to happen. It destroyed me anyway. The extended absences were worse. I would leave for 2 days, then 3, then a full week. I would return to find the cubs had established their own routines, their own territories, their own relationship with the land that did not include me. Taraji in particular had become bolder, challenging young male lions who wandered into the valley, asserting dominance over a territory that he was claiming as his own. Amara had become a ghost, her hunting skills so refined that I often could not spot her even when I knew she was close. They were becoming wild. It was the entire point. Felt like dying. On the day I attached the radio collars, both cubs now 13 months old and nearly adult-sized, Amara let me approach but did not rub against my legs the way she used to. Taraji submitted to the collar with impatience, clearly wanting to get back to more important activities. When I stepped back, released them from my final physical check, neither cub looked back as they moved off into the grassland. I stood in the training valley for 2 hours after they left, waiting for something I could not name. Goodbye perhaps. Acknowledgement that the last year had mattered, that I had been more than just a food source and warm body. But the cubs did not return. They had moved forward into their own lives, as they should, as they needed to. And I returned to my vehicle and drove back to a station that suddenly felt unbearably empty. The monitoring phase lasted 6 months. I tracked their movements through the radio collars, checked the camera trap footage weekly, and coordinated with other rangers to ensure they were not getting into conflicts with human settlements. Amara and Taraji had claimed overlapping territories that covered nearly 40 square kilometers, a range that would have seemed impossible for lions so young. But these were Zara's children, and apparently her genetics included a refusal to acknowledge conventional limitations. They hunted successfully more often than not. They avoided humans almost entirely. They were, by every measurable standard, wild lions. And then one morning when I was reviewing footage from a camera trap near a watering hole, I saw something that made me pause the playback and lean closer to the screen. Amara and Taraji, now fully grown and magnificent, were drinking side by side. But they were not alone. Another lioness, older and bearing scars that spoke of a long life in the bush, was resting nearby. And near her, 3 small cubs played in the shallows, tumbling over each other in the eternal game of young predators learning their bodies. The older lioness was not their mother. The camera angles and timing made that clear. But she was tolerating them, allowing them into her space, accepting their presence in a way that suggested something profound. Amara and Taraji had found a pride, or a pride had found them. Either way, they were no longer alone. I removed the radio collars after month 8. The cubs, now young adults, had proven they could survive without monitoring. The collars had served their purpose, and it was time for the last intervention to end. I darted them from a distance, removed the equipment while they were sedated, and left before they woke. No goodbye, no final moment, just the clinical completion of a project that had never really been about wildlife conservation. Had been about redemption. And redemption, I had learned, required letting go of the very things you most wanted to hold on to. For years past, I continued my work as a ranger, coordinating anti-poaching patrols, managing human-wildlife conflict, training younger staff in tracking and field assessment. I had encounters with lions regularly, though never in circumstances where individual identification was possible. The Mara held hundreds of lions across its territories, and the chance of encountering two specific individuals was astronomical. I told myself I was not looking for them. I told myself that every time I checked reports from the quadrant where they had been released, every time I studied pride composition data from the research teams, every time I took slightly longer routes that happened to pass through their last known territories, I told myself, and I knew it was a lie. Then one evening when I was conducting a routine patrol near the old training valley, my radio crackled with a report from a tourist guide. 2 lions, a male and female, had been spotted moving along the ridge road. No aggressive behavior, just passing through. But the guide was keeping his distance as protocol demanded. I acknowledged the report, noted the location, and tried to ignore the way my hands were suddenly shaking on the steering wheel. The ridge road was 2 kilometers away. There were dozens of lion pairs in this region. The odds were against it being them. I turned the vehicle toward the ridge anyway. The sun was setting, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and copper. When I spotted them, 2 lions moving with the easy confidence of animals in their prime. Their path taking them along a game trail that ran parallel to the road. From this distance, identification was impossible. Could be any lions. Probably were any lions. I stopped the vehicle, killed the engine, and stepped out, against every safety guideline, against every piece of training I had given to others. I walked away from the Land Rover and into the open grassland. If these were wild lions with no history of human contact, what I was doing qualified as suicidal. But something in my chest, some instinct that went beyond rational thought, told me to trust. The lions stopped walking, their heads turned in my direction, their bodies going still in the way of predators assessing potential prey. I stopped too, standing in the open, my hands at my sides, making myself as vulnerable and non-threatening as possible. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, nothing moved. The only sound was the wind through the grass and the hammer of my heart. Then the female lion lifted her head slightly, testing the air, and I saw them. The 3 dark spots behind her left ear. Mara, which meant the male, larger and bearing the beginning of a magnificent mane, was Taraji. My knees almost gave out. 4 years. 4 years since I had seen them. Since I had removed the collars and walked away. Since I had let them go into the life their mother had died trying to give them. And here they were. Alive. Healthy. Strong. Everything I had hoped for and nothing I had let myself truly expect. The lions were still motionless. Still watching. I could not know what they were thinking. Could not know if memory worked the same way for them as it did for me. I had been their entire world once. And then I had deliberately made myself absent. Did they remember? Did it matter? Then Amara took a step forward. Just one. Then another. Her movements were cautious but not aggressive. Testing. Questioning. Taraji followed his sister's lead as he always had. His posture wary but curious. They covered half the distance between us. Then stopped again. I very slowly, moving with the same deliberate care I had used all those years ago when I first slid my hand into the darkness beneath the lodge, lowered myself to sit on the ground, making myself smaller, less threatening, signaling that I meant no harm. that I was not here to capture or control. For a moment nothing happened. Then Amara made a sound. Not a roar. Not a growl. Chuff. The greeting sound that lions use with pride members. With family. And she closed the remaining distance between us in 3 long strides. I held absolutely still as Amara approached. Her massive head now level with my own as I sat in the grass. She moved closer. Her nose nearly touching my face. Breathing in my scent. 4 years. 4 years should have erased my smell from her memory. Should have relegated me to the category of forgotten things. But something in the way she leaned into the space between us suggested otherwise. Then Amara did something that broke every remaining defense I had been holding onto. She rubbed her face against mine. The social bonding behavior that lions use to mark each other with their scent. To say you are mine and I am yours. Her head pushed against my cheek. Then my shoulder. Then moved around to rub against my back. Claiming me. Even now. Even after all this time. As part of her world. Taraji approached more slowly. His wariness evident in every line of his body. He had always been the brave one. The foolish one. But age had taught him appropriate caution. He circled around to my other side. Keeping his sister between himself and this human who smelled like memory but looked like history. When he was close enough to touch, he sat. His golden eyes fixed on my face. I reached out, moving with glacial slowness, and rested my hand on Taraji's shoulder. The lion's muscles tensed, ready to leap away if this contact transformed into threat. But it did not. It was just a hand, warm and familiar. Resting against fur with the gentleness of greeting. For 5 minutes that existed outside of time, I sat in the grass with Zara's children on either side of me. Amara continued to rub against me periodically, remarking me, re-establishing bonds that had never truly broken. Taraji eventually relaxed enough to lean his considerable weight against my side. Not quite trusting but not quite refusing either. No words were exchanged because words were never the language we had spoken. But something passed between the 3 of us in that golden light. Something that felt like forgiveness. Like completion. Like the closing of a circle that had begun with a rifle shot and a lioness who refused to die. I thought about Zara. About the way she had looked at me in her final moment of captivity. The way she had chosen freedom even when freedom should have killed her. I thought about the choice I had made in that moment. The decision to let her run. To stop being the man I had been and start the long process of becoming someone who could live with his reflection. I had searched for her for 7 years. Desperate for proof that my change had mattered. That at least one life had been saved by my transformation. I had never found that proof. But sitting here now. With the weight of 2 full-grown lions pressing against me. With the evidence of Zara's legacy made flesh and blood and beating heart. I understood that I had been looking for the wrong thing. I had not saved Zara. She had saved herself. What I had saved was the possibility of her children surviving. Of her line continuing. Of the 3 dark spots behind a left ear existing in the world for another generation. And in doing that, in choosing to fight for 2 small lives that should not have been my responsibility, I had saved something in myself as well. Redemption was not a destination. It was not a final accounting where debts were balanced and slates wiped clean. It was simply the choice made over and over again to be better than you had been. To honor the lives you had harmed by protecting the lives you could still reach. To carry the weight of your past without letting it crush the possibility of your future. The sun touched the horizon and shadows began to stretch across the grassland. Amara stood first, stepping away from me with a final rub of her face against my shoulder. Taraji followed, though he paused to look back, his eyes meeting mine one more time. In that look I could see the cub who had tried to climb everything, who had fought a monitor lizard with more courage than sense. Who had cried out in nightmares and needed to be held until morning came. But I could also see the lion that cub had become. Strong, healthy, wild. Everything a lion was meant to be. The siblings began to walk away. Their movements synchronized in the way of partners who had survived together and would continue to survive together. After 10 meters they broke into an easy lope, heading toward the darker grass where the evening's hunting would begin. They did not look back. They did not need to. I sat in the grass until they disappeared from view, until the darkness made seeing impossible. Then I stood, my joints protesting after the long stillness, and walked back to my vehicle. The drive back to the station was quiet. The radio silent. The road empty. When I arrived, the night shift ranger asked if the patrol had been productive. Said yes, though I could not explain what I had found. How do you describe the moment when the past forgives you? How do you put into words the feeling of a debt that can never be repaid somehow being acknowledged as paid anyway? That night I slept without dreams. Not because the memory of Zara was gone. It would never be gone. But because it no longer felt like a wound. Felt like a scar. Still there. Still visible. Still a part of my story. But healed in the way that only time and honest effort can heal. In the years that followed, there were occasional sightings of the two lions. Reports would come through the ranger network of a large male with an impressive mane and a lean female, often seen together. Successful hunters with a territory that spanned the heart of the Mara. The female was noted for her unusual markings. 3 dark spots behind her left ear that made her easily identifiable in photographs. I never sought them out again. I had been given my moment. The answer. My impossible gift of recognition after time and distance should have erased any bond. To ask for more would be greedy. But I kept track of the reports. Noted their continued survival. Their occasional integration with other prides. The rumors of cubs that might have been theirs. Zara's line continued. In a world where so much was being lost. Where lions disappeared from territories they had held for millennia. Where the work of conservation felt like trying to hold back an ocean with open hands. 2 lives persisted. 2 lives that should have ended under an abandoned lodge. Should have succumbed to poison and trauma and the simple mathematics of being small and alone in a world designed to consume the vulnerable. They had survived. And in surviving they had proven something that I had needed to believe but had not let myself trust. That change was possible. That the choices we make ripple forward in ways we cannot predict. That love, even imperfect love offered by imperfect people, can be enough to tip the scales between death and life. On the anniversary of the day I found the cubs under the lodge, I would drive out to the old training valley. Not to search. Not to hope for another encounter. But simply to sit in the grass and remember. Remember the terrified small bodies that had tried to shred my hand. Remember the long nights of fighting toxins and infections and despair. Remember the moment when 2 lion cubs had looked at me and decided, against every instinct and experience that told them otherwise, to trust. And remember the evening when 2 adult lions had walked back into my life just long enough to show me that the impossible thing I had attempted had actually, miraculously, worked. Past could not be erased. I had been a trophy hunter. Had caused death and suffering in service to an industry that I now fought against. That truth would always be part of my story. Would always be written into the history of who I was. But it was not the only truth. The other truth was that when it mattered most, when 2 lives hung in the balance and the easy choice would have been to let grief and guilt and the weight of my own failures determine the outcome, I had chosen differently. I had chosen to fight. I had chosen to stay. I had chosen to give Zara's children the chance that their mother had fought so hard to create. And they had taken that chance and turned it into a life worth living. As the sun sets over the Mara, painting the acacia trees in shades of amber and rose, I sometimes stand in the grassland where I once taught 2 cubs to be lions. The valley is quiet, peaceful, home to new generations of animals who will never know the history that played out here. That is how it should be. The land does not keep score. simply continues. Eternal and indifferent and beautiful beyond words. But I know. I carry the story in every scar, every memory, every morning when I wake and choose again to be the man Zara's eyes demanded I become. Redemption was not given. It was earned. One choice at a time. One life at a time. One moment of refusing to let the worst parts of your history define the entirety of your existence. I did not save Zara, but I saved her legacy. And in the end, that was the only kind of forgiveness that mattered. The forgiveness you give yourself by being worth forgiving. When I close my eyes now, I still see her. That lioness with 3 dark spots behind her left ear. Looking at me with eyes that saw not a hunter but an individual making a choice. I still see the blood on her shoulder. Still see her running on 3 legs into the darkness that should have killed her. But I also see 2 tiny cubs, claws extended, fighting for their lives beneath an abandoned lodge. I see them growing stronger, learning to hunt, learning to trust. I see them as full-grown lions, pressing against me in the golden light of an African evening, claiming me as family even after years apart. And I understand now what I could not understand then, that some debts can never be repaid. But they can be honored. They can be transformed into something that carries meaning forward. Every cub I help rescue now, every anti-poaching patrol I coordinate, every young ranger I train, is part of that transformation. Every life saved is a thread connecting back to that moment when Zara looked at me and I chose to stop. I am 67 years old now. My knees complain more than they used to. The scars on my hands have multiplied. And I know that I do not have unlimited time left to continue this work. But when that time comes, when I take my final breath under the same African sky that witnessed both my worst acts and my attempts at redemption, I will do so knowing this. That 2 lions run free because I chose to change. That Zara's legacy survives in their children and their children's children. That the 3 dark spots behind a left ear still exist in this world. A genetic signature of survival. A mark of resilience that refused to be erased. And that is enough. Has to be enough. Because in the end, we are not defined by the worst things we have done. We are defined by what we choose to do after we understand how much harm we have caused. The work of redemption is never finished. It is not a destination we arrive at. It is simply the path we walk. One step at a time. One choice at a time. One life at a time. And as long as I can still walk that path, as long as there are still lives that need protecting, I will keep walking. For Zara. For Amara and Taraji. For all the lions I helped destroy before I learned to help them survive. And for the man I am still, every single day, trying to become. The dust beneath the abandoned lodge settled long ago. But the lives that emerged from that darkness continue. They hunt. They survive. They carry forward a legacy that should have ended. And somewhere in the Mara, under that endless African sky, 2 lions remember the human who held them when they were small and terrified and alone. They remember. And in their survival they forgive. That is all any of us can hope for. To be remembered not for our failures but for our refusal to let those failures be the end of the story. To be forgiven not by forgetting but by earning, through years of difficult choices, the right to be seen as something more than the worst things we have done. My name is Daniel Thompson. I was a hunter. I helped create a world where magnificent creatures were reduced to trophies and profit. Carry that weight every day. But I am also the man who lay on a rotting deck and extended his hand into darkness. Who fought for 2 lives that everyone said were already lost. Who taught 2 orphan cubs to be wild when the safer choice would have been to keep them captive. Both of these truths are mine to carry. The difference is that now I get to choose which truth defines my future. And I choose the lions. Every time. Without hesitation. Because in the end, that is what redemption looks like. Not the erasure of the past. But the creation of a future where the past no longer has the power to determine who you become. The sun sets. The lions hunt. The Mara continues its eternal rhythm. And I continue for as long as I am able, to walk the path that Zara's eyes demanded I find. One choice at a time. One life at a time. One moment of grace offered to creatures who deserved so much better than what this world had given them. This is my testimony. This is my truth. And if there is any meaning to be found in a life that contains so much harm, let it be this: that even the worst of us can change. That even the most broken things can heal. That even when we have caused suffering beyond measure, we can still choose, in the time we have left, to create something worth remembering. 2 lions run free tonight. And that, in the mathematics of redemption, has to count for something. Has to.